Well, taxpayers across the country writing checks to address homelessness in a variety of different areas and capacities, but there could be a change in federal spending priorities. Just to get a sense of some of the conversations that are happening around the country, over in California, in LA, the county there is reimbursement of homelessness issues $53.7 million from the county. And that's for interim housing, with $52 million received this year alone. But residents in Los Angeles, they're raising concerns about how some of the homelessness hotspots are being handled by local officials.
Constituents in Skid Row face violent sweeps every single day, and unlike everywhere else in the district, do not get sufficient notice. The metal OHS signs in Skid Row serve the purpose of allowing city workers, along with LAPD, to come and destroy people's lives. We need an urgent change in Skid Row, and while we 100% know sweeps should end completely, constituents in Skid Row should get the same notice that others in the district do. Why can't sufficient notice be given to Skid Row ahead of these violent, traumatic sweeps?
Now, in Austin, Texas, officials there are discussing funding for homelessness programs through the Homeless Strategy Office, and it includes subsidies, with some attention on how the subsidies are affecting local and statewide taxpayers. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, a planned shelter and the estimated costs that continue to balloon, that was questioned by a resident at their city council meeting.
I am a member of St. Paul's Lutheran Church, and I'm here to speak against the proposed location of the low-barrier homeless shelter. One of our primary concerns is that this is going forward with inadequate planning. Funding relies entirely on donations and public dollars. What happens when pledges dry up? Fort Wayne will have spent $6 million renovating a building for a nonprofit it does not control that may not be able to sustain operations. In 2022, Indianapolis conducted a feasibility study for a slightly smaller, low-barrier shelter and projected $4 million per year in operating costs, more than 3 times Mayor Tucker's estimate. For a 2.5-year horizon, Indianapolis projected $10 million. Fort Wayne is projecting $3 million for the same period. That gap demands explanation.
Now, it's not just conversations happening at local city councils or county buildings. It's also being had in state houses across the country. At the Michigan State House, there are conversations about spending $3 million for transitional housing, including converting a area to make 10 apartments in northern Michigan. The plan uses fundings mixed from private investments, but also state taxpayer funding, signaling both local and statewide financial impact. Now, in Louisiana, costs have been discussed and how to deal with homelessness, including a $30 per day jailing costs compared to shelter costs that can get up to $20 million a year. And again, that's highlighting some of those taxpayer expenditures. At the New York State House, officials are discussing subsidies for homelessness programs, with the state budget including $250 million for housing vouchers. Now, housing vouchers are said to keep people housed, but some criticize the affordability and the amount of money being spent. And in the halls of Congress, there are discussions about $3.5 billion to be budgeted to support at-risk or homeless veterans. Again, that includes that taxpayer allocation of hundreds of millions of dollars. But what else could the federal government do? And are there efforts to ensure the best use of those limited tax dollars? Well, let's bring in the Center Square reporter, Tim Clouser. Tim, how is the Trump administration's housing and urban development approaching the homelessness issues? And just how much is this going to cost taxpayers?
Yeah, so the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, they released a new funding availability earlier this week, which was represents a drastic shift from the approach from the last 15 years to what they're moving forward to in the years ahead. And that's shifting from housing first to a recovery first format. So essentially in this $4 billion funding availability, they put new caps on how much funding will go towards renewing projects that have been around for years, mainly permanent housing projects, and in an effort to push a considerable amount of the funding towards new treatment-based case management type of services. The goal here is to stop spending more and more money on these taxpayer subsidized beds where oftentimes you have people living for years while they continue to use drugs without any precondition for participating in treatment. The goal here in the federal government is to save taxpayers money. Now, service providers aren't entirely happy, considering that they've been funding these permanent housing projects for years, but other supporters of this change think that it could represent quite a big difference moving forward in terms of measurably reducing visible homelessness and getting people to the point where they're able to get a job, able to pay for their own home unit and groceries, and to get off the streets themselves.
You know, from what we saw of reviewing just some of the conversations that are happening at local city councils, at state houses across the country, it seems that there's been this kind of focus, this priority of housing, of using tax dollars to set up these types of permanent or semi-permanent housing conditions. Just how much of a drastic shift is it of the Trump administration looking to instead do those types of rehabilitation services rather than focusing primarily on, is there a roof over this person's head?
Yeah, the past few years, the way the government has handed out funding, it's usually around $4 billion. This is the highest it's been. The last few years, it was just under $4 billion. But essentially, 90% of that funding in the past would go towards renewing these permanent housing projects. And then the other 10% would go towards case management, treatment, and stuff like that. Now there's going to be a 60% cap on that renewal funding. So it pushes about 1.5 or so billion dollars towards these new projects. The federal government's issue with the permanent housing projects isn't that people are being housed. It's that there's no preconditions to hold them accountable for these tax dollars that are funding the beds that they're sleeping in. Essentially, you have like some of the clips that Rand mentioned, these low barrier shelters, which essentially means that to receive housing assistance, you don't have to be sober, you don't have to participate in treatment or anything. You just have to show up and you get the service. Now, that's not going to change entirely. There's not going to be requirements that you, in terms of receiving the federal funding, that you have to participate in treatment. But the federal government is saying to Continuum of Cares and these service providers that are applying for funding that if you do ask these homeless individuals to participate in treatment in order to participate in your service, then you might compete better for funding than if you don't. So it's going to be quite a big shift. We'll likely see a lot of major cities like LA, Seattle, and Spokane shift how they apply for these fundings to adhere more to the funding availability. But what I've heard, particularly in Spokane, is that they're worried about the shift, but are trying to preserve local funds so they can backfill any gaps.
Well, in the question I was going to have about is who's managing this? Is it going to be the local governments who are getting those grants from the federal government, or is the federal government going to give them straight to the service providers?
Yeah, so how it'll work is in the next few weeks and months, you'll have the service providers working with the Continuum of Cares, which is essentially in a lot of metro areas, you have these Continuum of Cares, which is this collection of service providers and local officials that figure out what projects they want to prioritize for their homelessness response, and then they apply for that federal funding. Now, it's up to the federal government to award that funding, and they've set out a list of criteria in terms of how they're going to grade those project applications. Now, if you're clearing public encampments, picking up trash and needles, not permitting public drug use, you don't have needle injection sites, stuff like that, you can earn extra points. You can also earn extra points if you try to incentivize people to participate in treatment. So it's going to be up to the federal government to hand out these awards, but ultimately, once those awards are handed out, it's up to the service providers and the Continuum of Care to operate these services under the guidelines of the federal funding availability. And then it's up to the federal government then to hold them accountable to that.
Have officials made clear how tax dollars are going to be held accountable in all of this? You know, we hear stories all the time, not just with the Medicaid fraud that there is, but even questions about how, for instance, California anecdotally has spent billions on addressing homelessness, but it just doesn't seem to be actually addressing homelessness. How have officials indicated they're going to show some level of accountability here?
Largely through changing the funding guidelines that I had just talked about. And then moving forward in years after this, the goal is to tie funding to performance metrics. So in the years past, like I said, they've put much of the funding towards these permanent housing units, which have housed people, but you're not getting people to a point of self-sufficiency, to a point where the spending is going down. In the last, since 2013 to 2020 to 2015, from 2013 to 2025, nationwide, we saw homelessness increase 27%, and then taxpayer funded beds increased 151%. So the goal here is that by tying funding to metrics moving forward, that will fund more of these treatment style facilities, these housing projects that do require participation in treatment in order to receive housing. That once you see the success from these, they'll be able to better fund these projects moving forward.
Greatly appreciate you delving deeper into this, and we'll be watching your work and work from the rest of the team at the Center Square. Be sure to get Tim's story and others by subscribing to the Center Square newsletter free at thecentersquare.com.